Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today we are doing another Gardentober prompt. This prompt is feathers. And if you're unfamiliar with Gardentober, I'll have an informal video linked down below. But it's basically a drawing challenge that I host every October, usually on Instagram. But this year I decided to branch out into YouTube. And today for our prompt, I'll be following this lovely reference image by Leslie Lowe, which I'll have linked down below. And we're just going to dive right in. So you can see I've already have an oval kind of sketched out for the head. Some of this early part will be a little bit more difficult to see. I'll place a graphic over it so you can kind of see the sketch that I've placed just in general. But I'm using my favorite HB pencil, which is a clutch. I'll have linked down below. I have it freshly sharpened, so I'm able to get a nice crisp contour. And I'm just kind of placing where everything is going to be, making sure that everything lines up exactly where I want it to go. This really helps me to make sure that I have my proportions right before I start working on the harder lines of the contour, which is what I'm doing now. Now, if contour is a new word for you, it just simply means the outline. It's an expressive outline that really showcases depth and form, and so that's what I'll be following with this drawing method. And you can see here that I'm just going around the exterior, so I'm up kind of by his beak now, but I've already drawn out where the chest is going to be going down into the belly and where that will meet the feet. Now I'm working on the beak, and it tends to be, I don't know, I find beaks very tricky because we tend to just like want to make them a triangle, but they very rarely fall under that category. There's a little bit more of a curve, as you can see in the reference image, that's just a little bit more difficult to capture. And then birds don't usually have much of a cranium, at least kind of your typical stereotypical bird. They're just much flatter on top. Their eyes are much larger than we typically see kind of in a cartoon or just displayed in a caricature. And I'm going to continue to follow the contour, so just working slowly around each section of the bird and trying to map out where everything's going to go. I'm following my very loose outline, but it will be tweaked a little bit as I go, as I see like, oh, something is a little bit too far this way, or maybe it's smaller than I initially anticipated, and then we'll kind of work our way in, adding more detail and building the overall structure and personality of this beautiful bird. All right, now that our body is pretty much placed, so we've got all the feathers kind of placed in different sections of the wings, now I'm going to start in on the face. And actually, the first time I kind of place this in, it doesn't really work. I start to notice, things are just off just enough that I'm not able to place the eye correctly. So that's fine. We're just going to erase all of this section, and we're going to start again with what we know. So I know kind of the back of the head moving up towards the face is correct. So I'm starting there and I'm just working my way from right to left. So I've got kind of this tousled feathers right by the face. I'm drawing that in. Okay, this is where the beak should go, which will eventually kind of move out this direction, and that I can connect to where the eye placement is. So this is just very slowly. I'm really focusing on my reference image for this to make sure that everything that I'm drawing lines up with what I'm seeing on my reference image. Things to look out for as you're drawing the beak. Where does it begin? Is there feathers kind of at the junction between the beak and the head? A lot of times there's like a little bit more of a tassel. And then where is, like where's the overlap? Most birds will have kind of an overbite, if you will. Some, though, will have an underbite. So things to look out for as you're drawing a bird, as you're working on this realism, trying to capture this particular style of bird. And then, the fun feathers, really capture those. Really look for where those are coming out. I mean, this bird almost like has whiskers coming out at the base of its beak. I think that that's really interesting. And those are things to look for and to try to capture in a way to, really showcase who this bird is and, his individual style, if you will. Now for the eye, I really like to add a lot of detail to the eyes. Now I'm not going to go crazy and add every single speck or shimmer that I see in these eyes, but I really want to make sure that they're nice and deep, but I'm capturing that highlight and even that little bit of color. You can kind of see like this U-shaped kind of curve of color right at the base, at the bottom of the eye, and I want to try and capture that. So I don't want to fill that in. What I am doing though is I'm going real nice and dark around the outside of the eye, and then I'm going to fill in most of the inside. But you can see I've left a section that's a little bit lighter right at that base. That'll give a little bit more depth and dimension, and a little bit more realism to the eye. And of course, we're going to keep that highlight in there. It's pretty classic, very easy to include, and it is in our reference image. And from the eye, it's time to start adding in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to go in, and I'm not going to be including every single ruffle or feather, but you can see this part of the eye, like right underneath the eye, where there's just kind of this ruffle of feathers that just seems a little bit more distinct. I want to capture that, and I'm going to try and look for those like larger blocks of feathers that I can really highlight and show off. I feel like that captures the form well without me having to necessarily draw every single feather. And especially when I'm drawing animals, you'll hear me talk about this a lot. A lot of details like this are a stylistic preference, where you really need to decide, do you want to be super photorealistic where you are drawing every single element? Are you going to do just the contour where it's just the outline? You're not really going in and adding in some of this texture, some of this detail in? Or are you going to kind of be in between, which is kind of where I land, although I would say I tend to go more towards a little bit more simple, where I am capturing some of this personality, some of the detail in there, but I'm really just showcasing, how it demonstrates the form a little bit more. So it's almost more like I'm trying to showcase more depth rather than showcasing texture that's there. You'll see more as I continue. I spent a lot of time working on these top feathers that have just their own little personality. It looks like he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. But I won't spend as much time on kind of the individual back feathers. But yeah, you'll see this is just kind of like a way to kind of further define, but also to show off your personal style and kind of who you want to be as an artist. One thing that you'll see sometimes from me is that I'll kind of decide on a style and then I'll have to kind of tweak the rest of the illustration in order to match it. I'm really liking having kind of the ruffle of the feathers, just kind of these little scribbles, but then having a little bit of a shadow underneath it. But in order to do that, everything else needs to be a little bit tighter. So I'm going in with these wing feathers and I'm getting them nice and crisp, where before they were a little bit messy and I let them be that way. I like that I was able to have that juxtaposition of the contrast between the two, where we've got a little bit of a messier shading, but then the contour is a little tidier. And so I'm going to continue that with each of these wing feathers. And I'm not exactly following the reference image in this aspect where, I'm counting exactly how many feathers are going in, but I am going in, I'm making sure that the shape is being captured very well. And then when I'm going in with the texture, I'm trying to make sure that it makes as much sense as possible, that we're following kind of the contour of the feathers and the shape that they're going in, and then where the shadow should be accordingly. And just to do that, we're just tidying up a little bit, going back in. Obviously, I already erased kind of what I had placed there. I have a little bit of that shadow for the pencil, so I can still see where I'm going. But I'm using this opportunity to kind of follow these lines. Okay, where does this go? Where does that go? And how does that work with the design style that I'm choosing? And I'm just going under each of kind of these feathered sections, this texture that I've drawn in. I'm drawing these long horizontal lines, or these long hatching lines, these shading areas. And that just creates, with just a couple of lines, I mean really no more than 3 or 5, where I'm creating that shadow and that depth and giving this illusion of texture without having to sit there and draw every single feather. And this is a technique that I use for painting as well. You'll often hear me talk about doing a negative space painting or working from the shadow, and that is where I'm kind of creating this line like, okay, well, this is where the highlight ends, or this is where the shape ends, and underneath where that ends, kind of the base, I'm creating that shadow. So instead of painting the actual feather, I'm allowing it to come to the surface, kind of to pop up because of the shadow underneath it. And again, that's what I'm going to continue doing throughout this process. That's what I chose to do, and I actually really enjoyed it. I think it worked out well. It's kind of fun when it feels very different drawing it that way, but it's exactly the way that I would paint it. So it kind of makes sense that I would fall into that technique. Reminder, as you're drawing something that is a little more difficult, like these bony little feet, pay attention to the junctions. Pay attention to how things come out, how things overlap. So you can see here that the leg is, from where I can see it, is in front of that kind of thumb talon that comes over the back. And so I want to make sure that I'm not sticking it in front or having it come out exactly from the back like we often will see, where it creates a perfect Y. That's not how it at least appears from the reference image. So I want to make sure that I'm capturing that and representing it well. And that is our finished drawing. Took me about 20-25 minutes as a whole, and that was with kind of experimenting and trying things out. I hope that this gave you some tools to use that you can use with your own animal drawings, and that it also encouraged you to continue to create on your own. If you'd like to hear more about Gardentober, I'll have all that information linked down below. And until next time, happy drawing.